So for Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2 is the king of the Spider-Man films. It always will be for me. The relationships that Peter has with Aunt May, um, MJ, Harry, J. Jonah Jameson, everything about that movie simply works. It's a phenomenal comic book film. It's a great movie. It stands the test of time. Doc Ock as the villain. The action is awesome. Everything about that movie just is first class. I can make the argument on any given day that Spider-Man 2 is the greatest comic book movie ever made. And I love, the original Superman. I love X2. Like, there's a lot of great comic book movies. Obviously, the Dark Knight trilogy, the 1989 Batman. There's tons of great comic book movies. I think Spider-Man 2 is the best. It's my favorite of all the comic book movies that we've seen so far. That includes all of the Avengers films. I think it's better than Endgame. I think it's better than all of those movies. That's how highly I regard that film. So I'm going into this movie with that mindset, right? Like I feel like I've already seen the best Spider-Man movie, and this is Spider-Man for a new generation. And I've also had a soft spot in my heart for Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is kind of a controversial opinion. I know a lot of people think that is the worst Spider-Man movie. I don't think it's even close to the worst. I think Spider-Man 3 is a significantly worse movie. And the thing I love about The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is that while it has too many villains, it's overstuffed. It's got three villains. One is just a throwaway with Paul Giamatti's Rhino. Um, and as much as those things don't work, the relationship that Peter has with both Aunt May and Gwen is a home run. It's the best part of those movies. It's fantastic. It's awesome. I love everything about that part of the film. So I've always had a soft spot for that. I don't think Andrew Garfield is like a good Peter Parker. I don't think that's his fault. I think that's more directional choices that Mark Webb made when making that film or those films. I think the first one is a complete dumpster fire, and I actually really hate The Amazing Spider-Man. I think the sequel is an order of magnitude better. I think if you go back and watch those movies back to back now, I think you would agree with me. I really do. The first one's trash. The CGI is like completely unwatchable and ruins the movie. And the second one is a lot better. Jamie Foxx is a mess in it. The whole Green Goblin thing sucks, but I don't know. I just love it. So those two things are true for me. And now let's talk about Spider-Man No Way Home, a movie that has an awful lot of hype surrounding it. So let's go. Thanks so much for checking out the video. Before we get started, click on that red subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you know whenever I post a new piece of content. So now that I've spoiled Spider-Man 2 and The Amazing Spider-Man 2, spoiler warning for this review, I'm going to talk about this movie in detail because it's really the only way I can talk about it. This is the type of movie that has so much going on, and I have to spoil it. I can't talk about it without getting into details about characters who appear and who don't. And so I'm going to spoil it. So spoiler warning, you've been spoiler warned. So what I like about this movie, the performances across the board are fantastic. Tom Holland continues to be a good Spider-Man and a really good Peter Parker. Do I think he's as good as Tobey? No. Do I think he's as good as Andrew? No. I actually think his portrayal of Peter is probably the weakest. But again, I don't think that's necessarily his fault. He's always kind of felt like a side character to the Avengers, which is something that I'll get into later, and one of the issues I've had with those movies, with the previous two of these films. But the performances are all great. Marisa Tomei is a great Aunt May. Obviously, you know that Alfred Molina's Doc Ock is in it. He's great. William Dafoe nails the Green Goblin, of course, / Norman Osborn. And everyone here is good, right? Even what little we get of J. Jonah Jameson is great. That's all wonderful. So performances here top notch. Something else I really like. This movie has emotional depth that I think the first two movies really didn't have. They had their emotional moments, the like intense, awkward tension between Vulture and Peter when they're in the back of the car and he realizes that this kid is Spider-Man, all of that stuff. is great, but this movie really takes it up to another level. And part of that is the previous characters that they brought back. So my theater went nuts when Matt Murdock appeared on screen as Daredevil. So obviously, really cool to see him. And then the introduction of the other two characters that really were the make or break for this film. Really, this was handled extremely well. So I had I had a lot of predictions about this movie that turned out to be wrong. I figured that, you know, Peter 1, Peter 2, Peter 2 and Peter 3 would be introduced during some like big fight sequence where they come in and save the day, and I was wrong about that. And the way it's handled is awesome. And I think the reason it worked so well for me is that it showed these characters as they are now. It didn't show us as we remember them. It showed us how we remember them and added on, 5 years in in Toby's case, nearly 20 years to when he last, or 20 years to when he was in, the first Spider-Man film. So that all of that is incredible. Watching them step through the portals, Andrew in the full Spider-Man suit, taking the mask off and revealing himself and being the same character, but a little wiser, a little more seasoned. And then having street clothes Tobey Maguire step through the portal, and he's clearly older. They didn't use any of that de-aging technology. And he talks about it. He talks about how things were really hard with MJ, but they made it work. And you realize that this Peter he ultimately got the happy ending that he deserved after going through so much in the original Spider-Man trilogy. So the introduction of those characters is top notch, and the way they fit into this film is really great. So seeing where those guys are now was a really cool way to do it, and I appreciated it. Something else I really liked, and I didn't see the death of Aunt May coming. I really didn't. And this Peter hasn't had that moment. He hasn't had that situation where he's had to deal with the death of somebody he loves and it be his fault. Completely 100% his fault. We don't know what happened to Uncle Ben. I think this universe, we don't know. I don't think this is clearly his moment, right? Like, based on how you watch this movie, this Peter was not responsible for the death of Uncle Ben. He just wasn't. Because you see that here in the death of his aunt, who's his everything. She's his world. And yeah, so the way all of that is handled is great. And I think having the Goblin be the one that does it, this guy that he had tried to help and that Aunt May had ultimately, taken a liking to and instilled in her nephew, you need to do the right thing with this guy. I think having it be him was dark in a way these movies haven't gone dark before. And yet, ultimately, I think it worked and will pay off in spades for whatever they do with this character in the future. And to move a little bit further onto that, the impact that this is going to have on the future Marvel universe, whatever you want to call it, I think is great. My favorite scene in the movie is when they're sitting there comforting him and hearing Toby's Peter talk about how he was responsible for the death of Uncle Ben. And then the scene that completely broke me. The scene that completely broke me is when Andrew's Peter says, I lost Gwen. She was my MJ. And that scene completely broke me. That just broke me in the theater. So all of that emotional punches here, and that scene was awesome. That scene was everything I wanted in this movie, and not a single punch was thrown. Not a single punch was thrown. That was how I felt at the end of Spider-Man 2 when MJ sees that Peter is Spider-Man for the first time. It was a completely different situation, but it had that emotional punch for me. So loved it. I loved everything about that. Something else I loved that Green Goblin and Norman Osborn was the villain. That was something I kind of thought might happen because he was so undershown in the marketing. And I think that they played up the Doc Ock thing and having him essentially turn into, the good guy at the end, who helps them, worked. And then having Norman Green Goblin as the bad guy also worked in spades. So I loved it. Really, Alfred Molina's portrayal of Octavius, he stepped right into it, and he was phenomenal too. And lastly, taking Peter, and this is a big one for me, removing Peter from the Avengers by way of the memory wipe spell that Doctor Strange does at the end. I think that's a smart move. I think it's an incredibly smart move. The thing that's bothered me about the first two films is that they were so anchored by the Avengers that it felt like he was just a bit player. And now I think they're going to make a new trilogy that will allow Peter Parker / Spider-Man to be himself. And he has to, there's a shot at the end of the film where he's got a sewing machine and he's making his own suit because that's who he is now, right? He doesn't have Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr., Tony Stark is dead. That character is gone. So he has no help anymore. Happy Hogan doesn't remember who he is. None of the Avengers, nobody in the galaxy remembers who this guy is. So untethering this character from that universe while still having it be in that universe is a really good move. And I think it'll pay off in spades. And something else I liked is the little stinger at the end with Eddie Brock coming in from his alternate universe and then ultimately disappearing and leaving behind the symbiote. I think it was a really, really cool way of introducing Venom into this universe because clearly that's what they're going to do. They're going to have a completely different version of Venom in this universe, and I love it. I love that Sony and Marvel were able to work that out and essentially work it into a stinger scene at the end of the film. So there's also some things that I don't like about this movie, so I got to talk about those too. There's not a lot. The thing I feel about everything I feel about this movie is overwhelmingly positive for the most part. So this Peter is a complete screw up, and everything he does just turns to crap. He's a complete failure. Everything he does is a train wreck. He always makes the wrong decision. When he's trying to take the MacGuffin device that sends these guys all back to their own universes, I was like, what are you doing, dude? What are you doing? Like, how do you not see that this is going to screw up? How do you not see that Norman Osborn is going to stab you in the back? This Peter just is, he is a kid. And in his defense, he is a kid. But man, he's a screw up and he always makes the wrong decision. So in this movie, it's like glaringly obvious that he's just doing everything the wrong way. And I just didn't like that. The whole Happy Hogan thing with Aunt May felt completely stuffed in and unnecessary, and I just didn't like it. The pacing in the beginning of this movie is a little strange. I think IGN had a really good illustration of how they described this movie. They said it was like a Saturday morning cartoon, and I think that especially is the case really in the first half of it. When the other Peters show up, the movie takes off and becomes next level. I think the movie becomes phenomenal after that, and I love it. I love it after that. The beginning, some pacing problems, very much Saturday morning cartoonish. So shout out to IGN for that illustration. I thought it was just strange in the beginning. J. Jonah Jameson, a little bit underutilized, kind of bummed about that. He's good in what he's doing here, but having him not be in the newsroom is also a bit of a challenge. They make him more into like this conspiratorial Alex Jones type character, and I respect them doing that. It's different. And it makes sense, I guess, in the digital age in the context of this movie. I just didn't like it. So tough luck. Last thing is the Tobey Maguire's Peter getting stabbed at the end served absolutely no purpose. It just turned into a joke. Like, why? I thought they were going to legitimately kill that character off. And I was like angry about it. And then he's like, oh, I'm fine. I've been stabbed before. I was like, well, why? Like, why is this even in the movie? It was completely unnecessary. And something I want to mention too, that's all I didn't like about it. So everything else I loved, that stuff I didn't like. The scene at the end where he's going to stab Goblin with the glider and Toby's Peter grabs it and he doesn't even say anything. That scene also got to me. That scene got to me so hard because there was no quippy dialogue. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him. And you could see him like drilling his eyes into his skull. And just telling him this isn't you. This isn't Spider-Man. This isn't something Spider-Man would do. And I thought that part was also amazing. So in conclusion, I really, really, really love this movie. And the way I know I love this movie is that I really liked it when I watched it, and I can't stop thinking about it. That doesn't happen a lot with me. I can be very hit or miss when it comes to films. Like, I'll walk out of a movie and be like, that was complete and utter trash. Or walk out of it and be like, oh, that was amazing. And then I kind of sour on it the more I see it or the more I think about it. And this movie really is, it's really, really well done. It's must see if you're a Spider-Man fan. It's really, really good. If you have soft spot for the Raimi films in particular, and even if you enjoy the Amazing Spider-Man and Amazing Spider-Man 2 a little bit, I think this movie is really going to have it's gonna tug at your heartstrings in all the right ways, and I think you should check it out. So it's in theaters. That's the only place you can see it. That's where you should see it. I might go see it again in theaters because I loved it that much. So thanks for checking out the review. If you liked it, if you found it helpful, please consider subscribing. You'd also like and share the video. That tells YouTube that it's worth promoting. Hit me up in the comments. Let me know what you think of Spider-Man No Way Home, and I'll see you next Wednesday at 9 a.m.